This is the Regained Wellness Podcast with Jamie Logie, Episode 6, Weston A. Price. Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jamie Logie. I run regainedwellness.com, and this is the 6th episode of the Regained Wellness Podcast. And so far, only been up for around a week right now. And this is just the 6th episode, and already I'm in the top 10 under the new and noteworthy section on iTunes under the fitness and nutrition podcast category. So that's awesome so far. Thank you for whoever is listening, and just encourage you to share this, subscribe to iTunes, leave me a rating and review if you can, because that really helps spread the show, gets more people to see it, gets in front of more eyes. And like I said, I run regainedwellness.com, and the website's set up to provide a wide variety of primarily nutrition information, also like fitness and general wellness information. So I write on a wide variety of topics ranging from things we've even covered in the podcast so far, like the paleo diet or gluten or artificial sweeteners or things of that nature. If you are new to getting healthy, fit, trying to get on top of your nutrition, trying to take control of your diet, you can sign up for my free ebook. It's called the Health Eating Starter Kit, and it provides a lot of information on some foods you want to be including, and just as importantly, foods that you want to eliminate. And you can sign up for that by going to regainedwellness.com/guide. So today is a very interesting topic to me. This is one of my favorite subjects. And it might sound a little boring, but when you realize what went behind this man and all his work, you'll realize how important it is to follow the work of Weston A. Price. And some may call Weston A. Price the Charles Darwin of nutrition, because he was kind of at the forefront of opening people's eyes into the power of nutrition and what the introduction of modern or westernized foods, if you want to call it, the detriment they would have on the human body. So we're going to get right into it here, as Weston A. Price really did lay the framework almost a century ago now for, things that are really big today, like, real food movements or the paleo movement. His investigation started with a simple why. He wanted to know a lot of things on why he was seeing changes now in the the children of his patients that he had not seen in them before. So when you become familiar with his work, you'll see all the positive benefits, health benefits that this can have for you. His book that you could almost call the origin of the species of nutrition is called Nutritional and Physical Degeneration. And I highly recommend it. I'll put a link in the show notes, which is the information about the show that'll be on my website on regainedwellness.com. So in those, on the blog post that includes the link for the podcast, I can put in links of the things we talk about in the show. So you can refer back to the website and have links to all these different things. So this is a book you can get on Amazon in ebook form. I've read it a ton of times. It's actually really amazing. So this book, like we say, it's kind of like, we say he's the Charles Darwin of nutrition, and this book is sort of the origin of the species, in that it really revealed how the modern diet was responsible for many conditions we've never seen in the human existence. And all this starts back in the 1930s. And this is a time, obviously, when there was big advancements in, as far as industry. The automobile is kind of on the scene. Transportation is becoming a little more available all around the world. And Weston A. Price was actually born in Canada in 1870. I'm Canadian, if I haven't passed that on before, so I'll always make sure I can get that in the mix. So he became a dentist after graduating from the University of Michigan, which is right across the way from where we are here in Ontario. And he eventually set up his practice in Cleveland, Ohio. And obviously that's a big move for, moving to Ohio if you're a former U of M Wolverine. So his practice went on like any other would, but after a while, like I was saying before, Price was noticing a strange sensation, and it was that the children of his patients were starting to show dental problems that their parents never had had. And especially they were showing more of an incidence of tooth decay at a very young age. So it all comes back to that why question. Price started to notice that what these kids were eating had not really existed when their parents were younger. So they had more access to processed foods, things like refined sugars, jams, polished white rices, things like that were starting to become, commonplace. And as early as we're going back into 1894 here, he was starting to wonder if these newer foods could be responsible for the decay in the dental health. So in the meantime, one of Price's hobbies, among just working in dentistry, was he liked to spend a lot of time learning about primitive cultures. And he wanted to see for himself firsthand the state of not only the dental health of these primitive cultures, but their overall physical state. So this pursuit would take Weston Price on a 10-year, 100,000-mile journey to some of the most remote places on Earth. And remember, this is still in the early days of air travel and very limited transportation. So Price is not catching a blue flight from New York to Tampa. He's heading into like the actual treacherous unknown. And I've done quite a lot of traveling to some relatively remote parts, and it's still difficult in this day and age. So I can't imagine back in the 30s what this really was like, what kind of undertaking they were looking at here. So among the places he would go over his travels, he would end up visiting this is just a few different places, like some Swiss villages and some very remote mountain valleys. He ended up in the South Pacific Islands, went all over Africa, visited a lot of tribes through there. He came back to Canada, was looking at the Canadian Aboriginal reserves, quite a bit of time in Australia, in the outbacks, and made his way through the Arctic tundras. So, like I'm saying, this is not really a journey for the weak, as just reaching these locations was incredibly taxing, not to mention incredibly expensive at the time. So we want to look, what did he discover? So since Price was a dentist by trade, his first traits he looked at were an individual's teeth. And when we're talking about tooth decay, the technical term for tooth decay is known as dental caries, caries. And Price would measure them in all the tribes and populations he went to. So the thing that really astounded Price was the quality of all these people's teeth. And when you look at our modern and actually smaller jaws now, they tend to hold 28 teeth, but he found the various tribes to have perfectly formed sets of all 32 teeth, which is what the human mouth actually can hold. And Price found that these populations had no access to modern foods, and they were essentially still eating a diet that their people had been consuming for millennia. And there's a bunch of pictures in the book of these different tribes and areas he went into with the teeth, and I can try and put some of the pictures up so you can get an idea what he was encountering for the first time. And remembering that these diets are free from refined sugars, breads, white flour. It was basically observed when the ancient diets were switched from meat, vegetables, seeds, nuts, things like that, to carbohydrates like refined carbohydrates, sugars, the rate of tooth decay skyrockets, along with a real rise in some negative health issues. And when we're talking about the teeth, you have to remember these are tribes that have perfectly formed teeth that are not going to dentists. They're not using toothbrushes. They're not using scope mouthwash. They're not using whitening strips, those regular adjustments and cleanings, but are having perfectly formed teeth. So it gets us into the idea of the changing bacteria, that some of these remote populations were also getting access to modern foods. And not surprisingly, Price found that in these locations that the dental decay was starting to appear. And like I was saying, eons of a consistent diet was being undone in just one generation. And the big part of that was this changing bacteria. So the bacteria composition of the mouth was starting to switch, and did switch when our diets changed. When we started making the change from hunting gathering to farming, certain disease-causing bacteria that were efficient at using carbohydrates started to win out over other types of friendly bacteria in the mouth. In the advent of further refined and processed carbohydrates resulting from, industrial revolution advances were only making things worse. This move away from traditional diets to the modern had also caused physical degeneration, as is revealed by our now smaller mouths. As I mentioned before, our jaws can hold 32 teeth, and as our nutrition declined, our bone structure became weaker and our faces more narrow. Our jaws now did not have the room for all the teeth, and the crowded jaw, these newer shaped jaws, have resulted in the removal of wisdom teeth for many people. So there's some more pictures here where I'll try and put these up as well that show the tribes with people who are eating the traditional primitive diet, showing pictures of their perfectly formed teeth, and then pictures of kids who had been exposed to a modern diet, and you can see the changes in the teeth, and it's remarkable just in this, like we were saying, in this one generation. Scientists and archaeologists also note that our brain size has gotten smaller over the last 20,000 years, and the dependence on modern food, and even since the agriculture age, have led to weaker and smaller bone density, resulting in a smaller skull and brain cavity. We also have moved away from the healthy beneficial fats, especially those of the omega-3 variety that you'd find in seafood, nuts, seeds, and true grass-fed raised animals. And with our increasing use of vegetable oils and exposure to things like trans fats, they've led to higher rates of omega-6 in our body, and this causes a real imbalance of omega-3 to omega-6. So this leads to inflammation in the body and can promote diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancers, inflammatory disease, autoimmune disease. Even our brains themselves are physically made up of omega-3 fats, while, say, a gorilla or a chimpanzee doesn't have the same enzymes in the body or raw materials in the diet, leading to a brain that is not as developed. So what made up these primitive diets for all these different cultures that Weston A. Price was finding himself in? What were they eating that allowed them to remain in this ideal health and to be free of physical degeneration and to have pretty much flawless tooth and gum health? This clearly varied depending on the region, as Price studied, say, Inuits that had very little access to fauna, and they depended on a large amount of animal fat, things like whale blubber and proteins. The, say, tribes in the western side of the Nile and the Sudan were primarily a cattle-raising culture, so their diet was based around things like raw milk, meat, even blood some of these tribes would consume. Especially with these, western side tribes, Price regarded them, like I was saying, around the Nile and the Sudan, Price regarded them as being extremely unique specimens with great musculature, and the women would average around 6 feet tall, and some of the men were reaching 7 foot tall in these areas. There's also, talking about the other tribes, there's the Bantu tribe that were more vegetarian based, and they would focus on things like sweet potatoes, corn, beans, banana, millet, kaffir corn, sorghum, things like that. There's one tribe called the Dinkas tribe, which Price noted as the healthiest, and they had a diet primarily of fish. They also incorporated in some grains and millets. So just as a side note, grains is obviously a big topic all the time. I did a whole episode on gluten and the dangers of modern wheat and how we're eating too much grain in our diet and too much refined grain, and it's changed over the years. When these tribes are eating grain, this is not our kind of idea of grain by like the way of bread or instant oatmeal or pasta, but the grain they're consuming was more from a fermentation process that would make kind of a porridge, like a sour, acidic porridge. But this fermentation increased the minerals in those grains, and it would decrease some of the phytic acid, and along with the fermentation process, that can actually enhance probiotic content. So it would help for really healthy gut bacteria, which led to, these incredibly strong and muscular and very, like, these tribes and populations that are capable of great feats of strength and bouts of endurance. So interesting. So again, we're talking about the 1930s. It's interesting, in the late 70s, doctors would go back to some of these same regions that Price went to and noted that the people that, were first regarded as in pristine health were now experiencing things like diabetes and high blood pressure. So obviously what had happened, these doctors in the 70s had read the work of Weston A. Price. They're very familiar with where he went and very familiar with his findings. What had happened? The doctors observed that some new things had entered the diet, including now processed grains, as opposed to those natural fermented oatmeal porridges they were making. They were exposed to things like peanut and cottonseed oils and sugar, lots of refined sugar. The people were actually now averaging 100 grams of sugar each day. So the traditional food items were helping. They were still consuming a lot of the traditional food items, and they were helping to prevent many other diseases. But look at the toll that just adding in the sugar can do to the diet when they're now experiencing diabetes and things like high blood pressure. Basically, whenever Western food had been introduced to various traditional populations around the world, the same issues appeared. And Weston Price noted this even back in the 30s with processed modern foods. He was very aware of what these things were capable of. And there's just a passage right here from his book I wanted to read. And this is Weston Price saying here, "It is important to summarize at this point some of the data that I have developed in other chapters because of their direct relation to the control of dental caries and other degenerative processes. Since human life, like other animal life, has been developed in nature's laboratory to fit nature's natural foods, we run a great risk when we undertake to modify seriously these foods. Baker's so-called whole wheat bread is not comparable to nature's foods that provide entire wheat and other cereals, because of the factors that have been removed from the wheat either mechanically or by oxidation. This is so large a problem that adequate changes in the available grain foods cannot be made until there is sufficient public demand to produce them through the normal channels of supply and demand. It is primarily a problem for our federal and state governments. Packaged foods containing dry cereals can undergo important changes, even while the material is being processed or while in packages on the shelves. The determinations of the loss of vitamins in packaged foods, as reported in 1938 by the Agricultural Experimental Station of Oklahoma, Agriculture and Mechanical College, reveal that a material loss occurs in 2 weeks' time and a very serious loss in 1 to 2 months' time in certain stock rations." So he's talking about the processed modern foods of the 1930s. And if you look at these things from then, they could almost be considered superfoods compared to what we have today, because this is a time before high fructose corn syrup or real trans fat or artificial sweeteners, genetically modified foods. And I think this goes to show the damage that can be caused by not eating real food. And again, it has to do with getting back to your roots and getting back to real food. And I live here in southwestern Ontario, in London, Ontario, and I live 5 or 10 minutes away from some of our old Native Canadian Indian villages that have been kind of preserved in time. And there's some educational museums attached to these areas, and they show a real focus on when they were first, excavating the sites, that there was a big focus on foods such as fish, corn, squash, wide variety of vegetables. And that was what was available in their region at that time. And it varies around the world. Different populations are eating different foods depending on what was available in their ecosystem. So I've been lucky to do, like I said earlier, quite a bit of traveling, and I've seen some relatively remote places. I've been to Brazil. I've been into some small tribal regions and little coastal islands. I've been around New Zealand, again, down in the South Island and some more really remote areas, and meeting people who are still following a relatively ancient diet. They were avoiding modern foods. And then when you'd go into more higher population areas, then you start seeing the heavier set people and the rates of obesity starting to climb, which I really noticed in Australia. I spent some time living in Sydney and was able to travel quite a bit. So I noticed specifically when I went up to Cairns and up to Darwin and getting up around that way, meeting some Aboriginals that had moved into the city, and them having relatives like uncles and people who still lived off the land or lived off the bush. And it reminded me of a pretty popular study by someone named Karen O'Day, who had noticed diseases such as diabetes and heart disease affecting the indigenous population of Australia. And that once they'd moved into these urban settings and adopted a modern diet, they were starting to get all these diseases. And she set out to find if she reversed this, westernization, would she also reverse their health problems? So she looked at 10 middle-aged, overweight, and diabetic Aborigines and had them go to live a 7-week traditional hunter-gatherer life in a very traditional, isolated homeland in Northwest Australia that was more than a day's drive from the nearest town. So first, this is what they found. That when they looked at the previous diet of these people, they were eating things like, you can imagine, flour, sugar, rice, carbonated drinks, cheap meats, potatoes, pretty much a Western diet. While in the various regions in the outback, their diet was made up of things like seafood, kangaroo, birds, grubs, shellfish, turtle, crocodile, yams, figs, bush honey, plant foods, things of that nature. After 7 weeks with the blood test, O'Day found really striking improvements in their basically every level of their health, and they averaged an 18-pound weight loss. Their blood pressure and triglyceride levels dropped into a normal range. Their omega-3 ratio in their body went up. It rose up, and also the type 2 diabetes and abnormalities had either greatly improved or were normalized. And an interesting point that she makes in a study is that actually their activity level dropped while they were in the outback because they spent a lot of time sitting around conserving energy before they would go out looking for something. So they're actually less active, but then experience all this weight loss. So to sum up Weston Price, it's that continual reminder to keep your food real, to, as Sean Croxton, if anyone knows him from Underground Wellness, calls it JERF, just eat real food, that the more we focus on real whole foods and remove things that are manufactured or processed, better your health and your overall wellness is going to be for it. So I really want to recommend that you read Weston Price's book to get the full insight into all this amazing work and just his travels. I just reread it recently, and it's pretty mind-boggling when you realize everything that was going on. This is, getting close to 100 years ago now. You can also follow along with the Weston Price Foundation, which is online and keeps you up to date with different findings, studies, and just stuff like that. I'm always checking in on there. And as for me, hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast. Ideally, it'd be great if you could subscribe, leave me a review, rating, and it just really helps bump it up on iTunes. If you want to reach out to me, you can obviously check everything on the website, regainedwellness.com. If you want to email, just questions, concerns, if you want to see other topics, whatever I'll be able to cover on the show, you can email to me at info@regainedwellness.com. Check me on Facebook. It's facebook.com/regainedwellness, and even Twitter if you like that too. The handle is @regainwellness. wellness. So hope to hear from everyone. I'll check you on the next episode. We're going to be talking about the ways you can manage your grocery shopping a little bit better, and kind of the psychology that goes into the design of supermarkets to keep you in longer and to make you spend more money. It's actually very interesting, a lot of the tricks these people use. So just when it comes to everything with your health, fitness, as you're trying to, make improvements and strides and everything like that, remember progress, not perfection. See you next time.